Hello, and welcome to the RAS Step Up Your Safety series. I am Danielle Skillman and am the Director of Corporate Training at RAS. I will be moderating today's session, and we're excited to have Kelly Marshall here today. So before I turn it over to Kelly, I want to make sure to take a moment to share some general housekeeping information. Everyone is muted, and we will be taking questions during today's presentation. You can ask your question at any time, and we'll address those questions at the end. Please use the chat option at the bottom of your screen. Scrolling your mouse over the bottom of the screen, it should cause that chat to pop up. We know your time is precious, and we have a lot of great information to share with you, so let's get started. Today's presentation, Preventing Slip and Fall Injuries, will help you to understand how to prevent slip and fall injuries and discover strategies to enhance safety within your organization. Today's presenter is Kelly Marshall. Kelly started her career in occupational therapy in the field of inpatient and outpatient rehabilitation. During her time working for a large healthcare organizations, she gained experience in a variety of settings, including inpatient and outpatient rehabilitation, home health care, occupational medicine, pediatrics, and ergonomics. Kelly joined RAS in 2011, where her role included providing job analysis, ergonomics, and safety services to companies to help reduce their risk of loss-related musculoskeletal injuries. Kelly, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Danielle, and thanks again to all of you for joining us today. As Danielle said, I'm Kelly Marshall, and I'll be your host for today's session. My background is in occupational therapy, which I've used here at RAS to help apply loss control and ergonomic principles to assist you employers with managing your own injury prevention programs. I'm excited to talk to you today about the leading cause of loss, which are slips and falls in your workplace. A few of the things that we'll address are some of the slip, trip, and fall trends, some common causes of slip, trip, and fall injuries, and then we'll spend some time talking about the 10 best practices for preventing slips and falls in your place of employment. Injury data from the last 10 years indicates that slips and falls are the most common cause of injury among all industries that we insure here at RAS. So not only are they the leading cause of all workplace injury, slips and falls are also the leading cause of all lost time away from work. In fact, slips and falls are the most expensive injury category, even higher than the combination of strains, motor vehicle accidents, cuts, and burns. One of the problems, of course, is that slips and falls often result in severe injuries where we have multiple body parts that are injured, and then they can require extensive time away from work and expensive recovery. In fact, the average cost of a hip fracture case is over $26,000. In addition, the National Floor Safety Institute tells us that $50,000 is the average cost to defend against a slip and fall lawsuit, while $100,000 is the average judgment that's awarded in a case of a slip fall that may go to trial. So if those dollar figures don't already have your attention, let's look at some of the causes of slip, trips, and falls. Over half of the slips and falls in the workplace are created due to some sort of a problem with a walking surface. Another quarter of all slip and fall injuries are related to improper footwear. We'll spend some time talking about each of these in more detail today. We would be remiss to not mention one of the newer relationships with slip and fall injuries, which includes inattention or simply distraction. The plague of busyness has certainly increased the slips and falls that we see in the workplace as we're attempting to do too many things at one time, carry too many things, or we're simply distracted as we're walking. We'll talk more about how you increase awareness as well to prevent these types of slip and fall injuries. One of the co-contributors to the slip and fall trend that we see in the workplace is also the contribution of our aging workforce. The numbers on this slide are data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, And the bottom line, the yellow line along this slide, shows the population of the labor force that's age 55 and older. You can see that since the early 2000s, this percentage of our working population has been steadily increasing. As a matter of fact, it's now assumed to be about 25% of our working population that is age 55 and older. So some of the confounding factors with this, of course, are that as we age, we start to see some decreases that happen. These kinds of decreases can be found in things like our strength and muscle mass, our reaction time and the speed of our response being decreased, and a decrease in our flexibility. So of course, as we lose flexibility, we limit our range of motion, we see tighter muscles, and that of course increases our risk for injury. Not only those problems, but aging also contributes to decreased circulation, which results in a decreased oxygen supply and increases our fatigue. In addition, our vision doesn't go quite as well either. So we see a decrease in visual acuity, our depth perception starts to decrease, our ability to adjust to glare decreases, and in general, more light is needed. As if those things weren't enough bad news, aging also contributes to a decrease in our balance skills. So 35% of folks over the age of 40 suffer from some sort of vestibular dysfunction. This again leads to more fatigue, more slowed reaction time, and balance and vision limitations, which again increase our risk of falls. So we've talked enough about the bad news. Let's talk about what we can do about those things. We're going to spend the rest of our time talking about the best practices in slip fall prevention in your place of work. Just a reminder for you, you can find this list of best practices related to slip, trip, and fall prevention on the RAS portal under the resources section. We will also share this with the webinar recording following the webinar. So a good place to start is assembling a slip, trip, and fall prevention team. Some members that you might want to think about including are listed here: folks who are responsible for safety, people who have some say or some buy-in in your maintenance, your operational services, your environmental services, and housekeeping departments are all good people to have as a part of this team. The things that they should be concerned about are listed here. They should be responsible for overseeing your slip and fall prevention efforts and see that those things are brought to completion. They should also be responsible for completing and reviewing hazard assessments and incident investigations, which we will talk more about. They should also be concerned about being involved in construction projects and reviewing your footwear policies. Each of those we'll talk about in more detail as well. The next best practice is reviewing your own unique history of slip and fall events. So this is where you start to ask those questions about why specific things are happening in your facility, where are they happening, and when, and to whom. And it becomes very important that you understand why these things are happening so that you can help to do something about them. Incident investigation is another key practice in helping to prevent slips and falls in your organizations. These are things that you should be completing after you have any incident of a slip or fall. The sooner the better. And it's recommended that you complete incident investigation for near misses as well. If you don't already have a form that you're using, we do have a slip, trip, fall incident investigation report that you can access once again on our portal. This is where you ask those who, what, when, where, and why questions. It's also important to note that you may need to ask why multiple times to get to the actual root cause of why the incident occurred. We'll spend a fair amount of time talking about hazard assessment as well. As we saw at the very beginning, poor flooring causes more than half of slips and fall incidents. So it's really important that we can identify and, more importantly, remediate those hazards before that turns into a slip injury. It's recommended that you complete a formal hazard assessment twice a year, ideally during the different seasons and different conditions. We'll talk about why that's important. One of the key pieces in analyzing and looking at your hazards is to be able to assess the walkways and the conditions of your floors. We'll look through a couple of examples. Uneven, damaged, loose flooring and thresholds can be really good places for people to trip or slip, as well as poorly lit areas, especially when you have a significant change in threshold and you don't have a bright warning color to indicate that that's coming up. Other concerns here include low profile objects, things that can present a tripping hazard, especially things like buckets, when they have mop handles sticking out, empty pallets, things on wheels, and equipment legs or platforms that may stick out into a walkway and give someone an opportunity to trip over that as they're walking past. Another consideration is looking at your anti-fatigue or drainage mats. They can present a trip hazard along with items that are stored in walkways where someone might run right into those as they're trying to travel their normal path of traffic. One of the other pieces you may want to consider when you're doing your hazard assessments is looking at your entrance mats. They of course should be secure to the floor so they don't present a trip hazard, but they also need to be wide enough and long enough to make sure they're doing their job adequately. The recommendation here is that in dry conditions, entrance matting needs to be about 6 to 8 walking steps or 12 to 16 feet. However, in snowy conditions, that needs to nearly double. We need those mats at that point to go 10 to 12 walking steps or up to 25 feet. The rule of thumb here is that the matting should be long enough so that people aren't leaving wet or soiled footprints once they step off of the mat. One of the other things you should consider during your hazard assessment is looking at the condition of your stairs. Not only are the finishes slippery, but are the treads in good condition? Do you have damaged steps? Do you have inadequate handrails? Do they go the full length of the stairs? Are they loose, or are they not at the right height to actually be used when people are using the stairs? In addition, we all know that those unusual step designs, or when we hit an uneven step, it can throw our balance off a little bit. But as you can see in this picture, we can further complicate that when we include a busy visual pattern on stairs. Inadequate lighting obviously complicates this issue even further. Another piece of the hazard assessment is to inspect the building perimeter. So not only are we concerned about what's going on inside, but it's important to take a look at what hazards may exist outside the building as well. Things like crumbling concrete, thresholds that have a significant height difference, along with heaved or cracked concrete, can present significant places that people can catch a toe and trip as they're coming and going from the building. Poor drainage and parking stoppers that can be difficult to see are one of those pieces that you may want to consider assessing in different seasons as well. As you can see in this photo, we have some drainage issues, which makes that parking stopper a pretty significant trip hazard that we wouldn't necessarily see if we saw this in a dry or sunny condition. Additionally, it's a good time for us to be able to look at where that runoff is happening, or those spots that might tend to freeze and melt and refreeze again. This is also a good time for you to look for possible shortcuts that employees are taking through the landscaping. And sometimes you might need to use some creative landscaping design ideas to make sure that people are sticking to the approved walkways. We talked a little bit about footwear, which accounts for about 1/4 of all slip and fall accidents. Improper footwear, like those that you see on the slide here, can encourage tripping and slipping. So it's important not only to think about some of the departments where this may be significant, but to know what it means to require and encourage proper footwear. Proper footwear should look like a car tire, things with soft rubber soles and deep treads and channels, and things that are described as anti-slip or slip resistant are good rules of thumb. For considering what to include in a footwear policy, these are some things you may want to think about. Proper footwear should be required whenever the employee is on company property or company time, or when they're operating a company vehicle. And failure to wear that required footwear could result in some sort of a disciplinary action, including up to anything as significant as termination. It's important, again, that you enforce these policies and that you write those things up in an HR file if that's your policy. Most importantly, you should encourage supervisors to enforce your policy. A written policy is only as good as the enforcement of that policy. You should review this with employees at the time of hire, but also on an annual basis. Failure to wear that required footwear could negate the rights to a work comp benefit if they were involved in some sort of an injury or an accident and found to be in violation of the policy. I would also note that it's nice if you're able to provide some sort of a footwear stipend, but that's not necessary either. Also of note, we do have a sample footwear policy that you can access, again, located on the RES portal. Just a couple of notes on housekeeping procedures. A couple of good points here are for you to recommend that you clean just half of a hallway at a time, so you've always got a clear path of travel for folks who are using the hallway while it's being cleaned. Using floor machines that limit the drying time, and of course, using your wet floor signs. I would also encourage you to make sure that you're using those and removing those appropriately so that they don't become just another thing that people are walking by and they no longer take attention to that because it's up all the time, not just when the floor is wet. You should make sure you're providing absorbent materials for spills and educate staff on your spill response. Practicing prevention is probably your best bet in preventing slips and falls around your facilities. It's important that you have some staff that's dedicated to that ongoing prevention effort, folks who are responsible for ensuring your walkway safety, responding to weather changes, posting those warning signs, responding to spills, and then following up on the hazard assessments that we talked about. One of the other preventative measures that you can take are to manage your cords well. Reroute any cords away from your walkways, bundle them, braid them together. That not only decreases having multiple cords that you can trip over, but it also increases the visibility when you've got a bigger bundle. You can tape or Velcro those cords to the floor. There are lots of cord covers available these days, and lots of them are highly visible as well. And suspend all of those bundles of cords that we all have these days under our desks as best you can. Increasing awareness is also key. We talked about the plague of inattention and busyness, and some ways that we can counteract that are to not only remind and reinforce our employees of a footwear policy, but encourage them to also help report any hazards that they're encountering. You can include things like a safety minute during your staff meetings, or use an annual winter safety campaign to blast out those messages in emails or in newsletters, posters, text campaigns, any of those things, just to help keep that first and foremost in people's minds. Just a note on overseeing construction projects. On the one end, you want to work with your contractors on site to make sure that they have their own slip fall prevention plans while they're in your facilities, but you also want to work with them on any construction projects they're working on for you. Make sure that they understand you'd like to minimize any threshold heights and prevent some of those trip hazards, but also be mindful of the flooring that you're choosing. So both safety and function, as well as appearance, are of course important. And finally, keep internal records. You should be recording things about your maintenance procedures, the cleaning products that you're using in your facilities, those hazard assessment reports that we talked about, training programs that you're using for your employees to educate them on preventing slip and fall injuries, incidents of slips and falls that are happening in your facility, the investigations into those incidents, and then most importantly, the steps that you've taken to help remediate and prevent future slips and falls. So that's a quick run through of the 10 best practices in slip fall injury prevention. One more reminder, you can find all of these on the best practices list on the RES portal under the resources section. And do we have any questions? Danielle, I think you're muted. Do we have anything in the chat?
We do, Kelly. Thank you. That great information, but we have had some questions coming through the chat. So I'll just start with the first one. What is the most common cause of slips and falls?
Good question. So interestingly enough, I think especially for those of us who are located in the Midwest, lots of people think that slips and falls on ice and snow are the most common cause of injury. And fortunately or unfortunately, that's not really the case. Most of the slips and falls that we see are actually related to simply slipping, tripping over our normal everyday hazards during the course of our workday. So things like we talked about where people are slipping over, tripping over loose rugs and cords, and somebody who left their chair in the middle of the walkway. The most common slips and falls that we see are really just things that interrupt our normal path of traffic and are in places that we don't expect. So all of those things that we can do to increase awareness and make sure people are paying attention, not only to where they're leaving some of those things and in someone's path of travel, but also they're paying attention as they're walking down the hallway that they aren't going to run over one of those things.
Great, thank you. Next question. Our dress code requires professional dress for a lot of our employees. How do I encourage them to be safe when they're coming to and from work in their dress shoes?
Good question. So one of the things that we recommend and that I do myself is I like to have a bag for my dress shoes that I will plan to put on once I get safely into the building. But I actually wear and recommend that you wear the appropriate footwear based on the outdoor conditions for coming and going. So if it's a snowy condition, you should encourage employees to wear their footwear, their boots, their soft tread, their soft soled gripping sorts of shoes to come and go from the building. And then once they get in, they can have a seat and safely change into their dress shoes to wear those while they're traversing around the building.
Thank you. Next question. If someone falls and they don't necessarily get injured, do we have to report that claim?
This is a good question, and lots of slips and falls fall into this category because so often, myself included, we slip or fall in the parking lot and we're just embarrassed, right? We get up quickly and we hope that nobody saw that happen. I would still recommend always that you encourage your employees to report those kinds of incidents. So not only could that be considered a near miss like we talked about, which helps us then further identify some trends and talk about what prevention efforts we could have put into place that even if it didn't turn into a significant injury, it could have, and could we have prevented that based on some of the information that we have? That could be a potential. But it also gives us the opportunity then, if that were to be something where down the road someone starts to have some pain or have an injury that's related to something they can tie back to the slip and fall incident, then we've already started that process with the work comp claim being opened. So I would always encourage, even if you have employees that don't think that they need to seek medical treatment right away, or they don't feel like they were injured, I would encourage them to report those as a potential injury and make sure we've got all of the documentation in place and we can do that follow up with the incident reporting.
Okay, great. We have one last question. The question is, I have employees that are in and out of vehicles all day long, and it's really not reasonable for them to change shoes every time they get in and out of the vehicle. Like, how do I educate them? What do I say to them?
So we have lots of employees that are in this boat. We've got transportation folks, we've got bus drivers, we've often got maintenance, or even those staff who are responsible for doing the snow removal and maintenance. They do create some opportunities for transitional cleats or transitional types of footwear that don't then require an employee to change every time they get in and out of the vehicle, because that's not very realistic and the compliance is terrible if we're asking people to change shoes all the time, especially once they've started to need to remove those wet and snowy boots. So transitional footwear is a really great option that can be used to safely drive as well.
Great, thank you. Well, Kelly, I have put a link to a survey in the chat. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what our today's participants can expect and follow up to today's webinar?
Yes. So everyone will be receiving the follow-up email with the link to the recording for this webinar. If there's someone that you'd like to share it with, or you just really want to watch it again, you're welcome to do that. That will be coming from RAS Corporate Communications, just as your invite for the webinar was. So if you don't see that within the next couple of days, make sure you check your junk or your spam folders. It will have the resource for the 10 best practices that we talked about today. Again, that's available on our portal, but that will be included when you get your follow-up email. The link to the post webinar survey that Danielle posted in the chat will also be available in your email. So if you're not able to get to that right now, make sure you visit that spot just to give us some brief feedback. We'd love your feedback on today's session, but also on any topics that you're interested in hearing in our future Step Up Your Safety webinars.
Thank you, Kelly. And thank you all for attending our training today. We greatly value your partnership. And if you have any questions at any time, please reach out for additional assistance. Have a great day.
Thank you.